What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and to learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this week's episode is Gregg Easterbrook. Gregg was a staff writer, a national correspondent, as well as a contributing editor at The Atlantic for nearly 40 years, and has written for every notable publication you can imagine. I'd say that, in some sense, he is the archetypal Hidden Forces listener, in that he has a natural curiosity and a sort of fearlessness when it comes to engaging with a wide variety of interest areas, but also an optimism around his ability to understand the world. And as you will soon hear, an optimism about the world itself. In fact, Gregg's second most recent book is about why we should feel optimistic in a world where people feel increasingly scared about everything, be that climate change, artificial intelligence, pandemics, geopolitical conflict. And by the way, I am not oblivious to the fact that I myself often fall into this category. But the reason I invited Gregg onto the podcast was not to talk about all the reasons why we should feel optimistic, though we do spend the first half of the episode talking about this. It was to discuss his most recent book, The Blue Age, which explores this extraordinary transformation of the international trading order that we've been living through over the last 70 years, and especially over the last 20 to 30, and the unique role that the American Navy and advancements in naval architecture and marine engineering have played in making all of that possible. I don't know how many people truly appreciate just how unprecedented this long period of peace on the oceans has been, and how extraordinary the deflationary pressures have been for Western economies, and what this has meant for the expansion of credit and the growth in asset values in these markets. Topics that we've explored from a variety of different angles on this podcast. Today's episode is meant to give you a deeper understanding of this very important driver of peace and prosperity on the seas, and how its contribution to prolonging deflation, moderation, capital appreciation, and the remarkable absence of volatility across capital markets has been a core driver of the political and economic moderation that we have experienced over the last 25 to 30 years. Why we shouldn't take it for granted, and what it might mean for our economies and for our lives if the Blue Age comes to an end. As usual, the second half of today's conversation is available to subscribers only, and it's during this part of the conversation that Gregg and I have a chance to focus on the economic and geopolitical aspects of the Blue Age, the likelihood of conflict on the high seas, the incentives for and against it, and its consequences for the global economy. We also discuss some of the factors driving the current bottlenecks in global supply chains, the shipping industry's contribution to this, and why Gregg feels that these bottlenecks will be largely resolved before the end of next year. So if you want access to the rest of our conversation and have not yet become a premium subscriber, now is the time. There's no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and the entire library of Hidden Forces subscriber content going all the way back to episode 1 becomes instantly available to you, including the overtimes, transcripts, and rundowns to this episode and every other episode we've ever done. So without any further ado, please enjoy this week's episode with my guest, Gregg Easterbrook. Gregg Easterbrook, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Good to be here.
It's great having you on. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Where are you located?
I live in Bethesda, Maryland, the hometown of Anthony Fauci. I'm married. My wife is a retired Foreign Service officer, so we've lived overseas quite a bit, most recently in Belgium and Pakistan. But when we moved to Bethesda, we kind of settled down, and we've been here for a while.
Yeah, so you have had a storied career in journalism. You worked for a long time, I think, at The Atlantic. Were you also an editor there?
I did. I just barely missed 40 years of The Atlantic. The new management didn't want to keep me, but I did. All the previous managements liked me. I was there for 38 years as a staff writer, national correspondent, or contributing editor.
And you've written, Gregg, I mean, people who may not be familiar with you, besides being like I said, a really successful well-known journalist who's written for several publications, not just The Atlantic, The New Republic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal. You've also written, I was surprised to find, a wide variety of books on so many different subjects. What is the common thread there? Was there something that unifies all those topics, or have you just over the course of your career found yourself interested in a variety of different things? Because you've written subjects on globalization. I mean, this book on shipping and this subject that we're going to get into falls in that category, but you've written about football, you've written about existential meaning. So what accounts for that?
Well, I can tell you, if you talk to my literary agent about this, he's been telling me for 35 years, and I love my agent, I should pick one topic and just write the same book over and over again, because that's how writers make money. And I'm sure he's correct when he says that. I have always, perhaps you would say, indulged myself by writing what's ever on my mind. So I've written in 3 basic topic areas. One of them is serious public policy books, and the Blue Age that we're going to talk about in a minute is like that. My previous book, called It's Better Than It Looks, is assessing the condition of the world and finding it better than most people think. In my serious public policy writing, I would say the running theme has been that the condition of the world is better than most people think. I started with a book 25 years ago called A Moment on the Earth, arguing for environmental optimism, which was not popular then, is not popular today, but I think is clearly supported by the facts. And I told an interviewer a couple of months ago, my obituary will say the thing about his writing that made people mad is that he was optimistic. And that's true of all my nonfiction writing, except I wrote a nonfiction book on Christian theology, which doesn't bear on those issues. All the rest of them do. I wrote several books about sports. I have 3 kids. I wrote books about sports to put them through college, and they all graduated from college, and so I'm not writing about sports
That's so
anymore.
funny.
And I've also written 3 literary novels. I'm actually more of a novelist than a lot of the people who call themselves creative writing teachers at Ivy League schools are. They're all literary novels, not genre novels. And they've all been well reviewed, but not sold well, I must admit. And my novels number 4 and 5 are completed. And I am very hopeful that both of them will be in bookstores in 2022. That's certainly the plan. So it is quirky to write in different subject areas and in different styles. But in defense of my choices, I would say it's kept my brain engaged, and keeping your brain engaged is really helpful.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not just that you've written a variety of subjects and that you've also written novels, but it's the subjects of some of those, more artistic or romantic topics that I find so interesting. You've written about modern love, idealism, meaning in an age of doubt. I'm attracted to these topics. I find them to be not only interesting in and of themselves, but very relevant to the world we live in today. And when you mentioned also you wrote a book, a very successful book on exactly that you said before, like why it's better than it looks, why the reasons for optimism. Do you think that your ability to objectively assess the world, to remove from it your own bias, let's say the tendency of people to maybe catastrophize, that's actually an important part of writing about public policy? Because in order to know what we need to focus on with the public purse and with legislation, we need to be able to grapple objectively with the facts of the world?
The late Swedish physician Hans Rosling, who some of your listeners may know, said that we should practice factfulness as we approach the world. He meant that for objective things like pollution or economic data or global military spending, etc. We shouldn't allow our opinions to rule those subjects. We should review them factfully. Factfulness is the opposite of mindfulness. Mindfulness is what you do to your subjective emotional self. And I wrote a book in 2003 called The Progress Paradox that's about subjective understanding of modern society and why we feel the way we do about things. The book that you just kindly cited, It's Better Than It Looks, from 2018, is about objective understandings of modern society, what the data shows us and what we should think and where it would lead us in terms of the next phase of reforms. And I think if you look at numbers, and numbers are only one part of life, but if you look at numbers and facts, pollution's declining almost everywhere. Health outcomes are rising almost everywhere. Even in the era of COVID, public health is increasing in most of the world. Poverty is declining almost everywhere. War is in decline and has been in decline almost everywhere for 25 years. Urban violence has been up a little bit in the last year, and that's a troubling indicator. But overall, urban violence is way down in the last generation. Practically everything we can measure with statistics shows a positive trend, and you wouldn't ever believe that from turning on any newscast, would you? It's really important to bear in mind that the electronic media especially, and now the social media, call attention to themselves by crying doomsday. And they're almost always factually incorrect. But the goal is to call attention to yourself. And they're successful. And when I tell people about these things and when I speak to audiences, often they say, oh, but Gregg, even if you're right, things are getting better. We don't want to become complacent. If we believe that things are becoming better, we'll get complacent. My point is always that the fact that things are getting better didn't come out of the sky. It happened because of reforms of the past. And the success of reforms of the past is by far the strongest argument for reforms of the present. Climate change, inequality, and etc. These are not doomsday subjects. Climate change, inequality, and other serious structural problems of society, they can be defeated, just like we defeated smog and acid rain and other things. So I view optimism not as an argument for complacency, but as an argument for sweeping reform, which everybody says they want. So we'll see.
Well, I love what you've just said right now because, well, it raises a couple of points. Number one, we did an episode with the former Undersecretary for Science at the U.S. Department of Energy, Stephen Koonin. He was Obama's Undersecretary for Science. And it was very much along these lines. I mean, he doesn't deny that climate change, anthropogenic warming is real. But one of the major takeaways, besides the grappling with the actual realities of what we know and the uncertainty around the science, is something else he said, which is that it's not as bad as the media makes it out to be. That when you look at headlines around climate change, you see things like crisis constantly. There's constantly the word crisis, doomsday, apocalyptic imagery. And that's actually counterproductive, I would argue. While certainly we don't want to be complacent about problems that we face, I think it also does something, which is that it scares people into complacency. It sort of makes people feel like there's nothing they can do, and they don't want to engage with the subject because it's so scary.
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt that anthropogenic climate change is real, scientifically proven. Nobody should doubt this. But it's just not as bad as the media makes it seem, or as politicians and academics who benefit from frightening people over climate change want to make it seem. There's a huge amount of groupthink in academia right now about climate change. The competition to see who can use the most exaggerated scare terminology. And it's counterproductive, as you suggested. If you really think that the world is doomed because of a few molecules of carbon dioxide, and that's what it comes down to, that carbon dioxide is 400 out of a million molecules in the atmosphere instead of 350 out of a million molecules in the atmosphere as it was a generation ago. If that dooms us, if we're all going to die over that, as, say, Joe Biden has repeatedly said, including at Glasgow just a couple of weeks ago, that carbon dioxide is a threat to end human life. Holy cow, how can you get any more out of touch than that, or any more exaggerated? If you look at the history of the issue, greenhouse gases are an air pollution problem. What's happened with the previous air pollution problems? The key ones were smog, acid rain, airborne lead, and airborne soot. Acid rain and airborne lead are very close to eliminated, even in China. Smog is a problem in coastal China and in parts of the Indian subcontinent. It's declined dramatically in the United States, and it's on trend. The trend line is toward elimination. Airborne soot has been reduced, but we need more progress. All these things happen faster and for less money than, say, the media predicted. If you go back and look to see what New York Times said about all those problems 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they said it was literally impossible ever to stop acid rain. And now acid rain is very close to eliminate it. So as you listen to the rhetoric about greenhouse gases, it's important to bear in mind, these are air pollution problems. We can defeat air pollution problems. They are real problems, but they're not going to kill us. And I wish people would present the argument in those terms, because then you favor reform instead of just being depressed and hanging out in your apartment.
What do you think? I mean, is there a common thread that explains why we tend to obsess over certain things and exhibit certain types of behaviors, whether it is this negativity, this doomsday, not just with climate, but with other things? I mean, in your research, because you talked about how there's the subjective and the objective, and the subjective is why we feel the way we do. What is the common thread here that you've uncovered?
Well, I can tell you, and I have written about this, many others have as well, negativity about the condition of society is a long-running theme of the historical record. We're in the United States, so you look at American writing on this. Before the United States was even a nation, before 1776, it was common to encounter diatribe writing or pamphlet writing about how America was doomed and the end is about to come and the end is nigh. And some of it was religious in nature, but not all of it was. But why stop at the 1700s? Go all the way back to Plato. 2,600 years ago, Plato repeatedly wrote that society was sweetly ordered in his youth, but now everything is going to hell in a handbasket. And although he didn't actually use the Greek word for handbasket, he identified this phenomenon 2,600 years ago. I think people often exhibit what I called in the book Progress Paradox collapse anxiety, which is a feeling that, okay, things are mainly pretty good now. You look at the United States, I would argue, despite all the tension, all the stress, and despite COVID, I would argue that the condition of the United States, it is the best it has ever been in any year of the past, superior to its condition in the past for almost everyone. Of course, not for every single person. There'll always be someone who has a terrible disease or was just in an accident or has a broken heart, etc. But overall, the United States has never been better. We don't feel that way. People feel stressed out, they feel anxious, and I think collapse anxiety explains a lot of it. We worry that the current way that we live, that's mainly good for most people, not perfect for everybody, of course I'm not saying that, but mainly good for most people, cannot be sustained. That it's going to collapse at some point. And then there'll be some horrible condition worse than anything that anybody's ever experienced, and then it'll be too late to do anything about it. And I call that collapse anxiety, and this, I think, was deep in the American soul long before the physical collapse of the World Trade Centers made it palpable. And I admit to you, I cannot prove that collapse anxiety won't someday be real. I don't think it's going to happen. And in fact, I think it's very unlikely to happen. I can't prove that it won't happen. Maybe it will happen. Maybe there will be some horrible collapse. And I think because we're all trained to fear this, and especially if you got a good college education, I wish everybody went to college. College is one of the greatest things about the United States. But what do they teach you in college? They teach you to be upset and angry about everything. So if you got a good college education, you're right on the edge of your chair every minute, waiting to turn on the news or open the newspaper and find out that the collapse has begun. And I think that's one of the reasons people so overreact to climate change. It's a real problem that we've got to fix. It is not the end of the world. But people think, aha, this is the beginning. We see the collapse. A lot of people have felt this about COVID. COVID was, before there was a vaccine, we didn't know how we were going to stop it. Now it's a question of just getting the vaccine into everybody's arm. But it feels like, here it comes. It's the warning. It's one of the horsemen. And many of us, if not all of us in American society, are constantly scanning the horizon for those four horsemen. And I don't think they're ever going to arrive, but I can't prove to you that they never will.
Do you think that this collapse anxiety has, first of all, do you think it's gotten worse? And if it has, do you think that this is because our scientific understanding of the world has improved and our capacity to predict and order our future has improved? And so people's expectations around what they can control has gone beyond what they're emotionally comfortable with dealing with, the recognition that ultimately the world is uncertain and that we only have a limited amount of control over things and that we are all mortal?
There's an element of that. There's my 2009 book titled Sonic Boom that you mentioned, that's about globalization, has a chapter where I try to describe how the international economy is controlled. And I describe it as a master control room, like where the villain sits in a James Bond movie, and there's huge screens and dials and levers and ray gun dishes. And I say, but who's sitting in this chair? Who's the person who's manipulating these controls? Guess what? No one sits in that chair. The international economy is not controlled by anyone. And I actually think, this is an economics topic, I think that's one of the reasons it's so strong, because it doesn't have central control. It's able to self-correct in a way that centrally controlled institutions have a very poor track record of self-correcting. But we want there to be someone in charge. We want them to be a plan. We want to believe that what's happening is the unfolding of a plan, whether it's a divine plan or a human plan or a right-wing plan or a left-wing plan. We don't want to think that events are just happening based on distributed decision-making that no one can anticipate. And you know what? Events are happening based on distributed decision-making that no one can anticipate. We have a lot of trouble dealing with that as human beings. We want a narrative on everything. Now, when you come to the word narrative, it's become fashionable in the last couple of years to call what the mainstream media, especially New York Times, CNN, etc., generates as the narrative. And it is a narrative. You know, there are, in both theology and in media, sins of commission and sins of omission. In the media, we see sins of commission when something is factually wrong, and everybody's embarrassed about that. And we see sins of omission when you simply don't say things. So, for example, last 26 of the last 27 years, the intensity and casualties of global combat have declined, not increased, and global military per capita spending has declined again in 26 of the last 27 years. Have you ever seen that in the New York Times or heard that on CNN? We just simply don't mention that because it doesn't support the narrative. And I'll give you a much more relevant statistic to our current situation. After Glasgow, the latest global warming international summit, after the 2000 campaign and a lot of the very heated rhetoric and a lot of the horror of having done, I was not a Donald Trump supporter, but it was so horrible that he was in the White House because he is going to allow pollution. You would think that greenhouse gases from the United States are way up. Greenhouse emissions in the United States peaked in the year 2005 and have declined for 16 consecutive years. Whether the president is a Democrat or a Republican, our greenhouse emissions have already peaked and are already going down. Have you ever read that in the New York Times? I think not.
So, man, we were supposed to talk about the Blue Age. And,
yes, let's not forget.
No, we're going to, but this is so fascinating. You have so many interesting views, and so many of which I think dovetail with either things that I've talked about or things that I've thought about that maybe we haven't explored much on the podcast. I couldn't agree more about commission and omission and narrative. I think it's such a timely observation, your point about people's bias or desire to find some, headquarters of control of the planet, of the economy, of politics. It speaks to the ready absorption of conspiracy theory. And that's also not a proper term, conspiracy theory, rather alternative theories of reality for which there may really be no evidence at all, and which, if you looked at them objectively, could appear utterly just absurd, but feed people's need to have a narrative that explains the world, that explains all the uncertainty. A perfect example recently is that I've got friends who are smart, successful people who nonetheless readily believe all sorts of alternative theories about why this most recent variant of Omicron has come onto the scene, whether it is itself, because its mutations are so beyond the most recent variant, that it was introduced artificially into the environment, or, for instance, that its emergence is totally natural, but that the media's interpretation and the media's narrative around it is artificially constructed and coordinated. I think people who haven't worked in media, as you have, for example, and as I have, don't appreciate the cottage industry that the media is and the sort of low-hanging fruit that producers and writers and editors reach for, which is really built off of a set of assumptions, biases, presuppositions, and existing narratives and templates that you want to insert stories into. So to your point about Donald Trump, so much became about Donald Trump. Or I was looking at CNBC this morning, and they talked about how the markets fell, and the markets fell because yesterday, Moderna's CEO was on CNBC saying that the vaccines aren't going to be as effective. That's not why the markets fell. No one knows why the markets fell, but it fits a narrative.
It makes it a story, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we should all bear in mind, we're keenly aware of the expansion of social media, which is really just the last 15 years. The iPhone was 2007, I think. Facebook was 2006. Social media is a very recent phenomenon. And I hope it's a phenomenon that's in the process of burning itself out, because I think we'll be better off without it. But what's happened with social media? The ability to project doom into your life has improved in a technological way. We're getting much better at precision targeting the things that you personally, insert you for whatever named person you want, the things that you personally fear, the things that you personally will respond to. We're getting better at Politicians are getting better at it. Micro-targeting of voting blocks is down to individual neighborhoods, street by street now. All this stuff is driven by technology, which I don't think we should control, and I would say we probably couldn't control it even if we wanted to. It's all protected by the First Amendment. I don't want to do anything about the First Amendment, but it has a harmful effect on society of relentlessly drumming the negative right into our prefrontal cortex while shushing out anything positive. And also, when I say this to audiences, people will say, well, journalists have always preferred bad news. The front page of the newspaper has always been the 10 most negative things that the editors could find that day. And that is true. It has always been that way. But when you put the newspaper down on the table and got up and walked away, the newspaper did not follow you. Now we all carry our phones with us and look at them obsessively. When we walk out of the room where the newspaper is, the phone is still following us, and the phone is literally in our faces, reporting whatever the most negative possible slant of the news is. And we're all addicted to our phones, and it's all driven by the algorithms that you know about.
I couldn't agree with you more, Gregg. So let's transition to your latest book, and then maybe there will be an opportunity to revisit some of these themes again in the overtime. As I mentioned, your latest book is titled The Blue Age. What is the story that you tell in that book, and what motivated you to write it?
So I'm a believer in trying to think of things in interdisciplinary terms. The world is full of experts, and we do need experts. But think about the way to choose any Ivy League university or any good university. It doesn't have to be in the Ivy League. Think of how it's organized. You've got a department that does physics. You've got a department that does economics. You've got an department that does sociology. You've got a department that teaches Paraguayan poetry. They're all separate from each other. They don't try to combine their thoughts into one cohesive understanding of the world. They advance their own agendas. There's nothing wrong with this. It's just a way to understand what they're doing. The experts that we find in government are the same way. President of the United States, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, whoever it is advised on energy by an energy expert, is advised on public health by a vaccine expert. And they advance their own particular views of the world. There isn't anybody who says, so how do we screw all this together? In a minor way, I've tried to do that with The Blue Age. I've taken 3 things that seem not to have much to do with each other, and the book has 3 sections. The first section is about the decline of war at sea. In our lifetimes, there's been only one major battle at sea, and it was a major battle that was relatively brief by historical standards. I say, and I stand by this statement, that you've got to go all the way back to the Phoenicians to find another period of 60 or 70 years when there was no fighting at sea. Human beings have killed each other on the water just as much as on land, but we're not as aware of it because the dead bodies sink into the water, the ships sink. There are no memorials at sea. There are no parks that you can visit. I was in Gettysburg doing a history trip there a short time ago, and Gettysburg is a fascinating place to visit. You can't visit Jutland because it's in the water, and everything that happened there sank. So why has fighting at sea almost disappeared in our lifetime? That's the first third of this book. The second third is, okay, fighting at sea has stopped. What's the effect? The effect has been a gigantic increase in international trade. 100 years ago, on the eve of World War I, 4 to 5% of the world economy was based on trade. On the eve of COVID in 2019, it was 26% of the world economy is based on trade. There's been a gigantic increase in trade at sea because warships are not sinking cargo ships anymore or capturing them. Both those things prevent trade at sea. And trade at sea, we grumble about globalization. Everybody likes to complain about that long polysyllabic word, but it's held prices down all over the world. It's held inflation down all over the world. And by far most important, it's reduced poverty in Asia. 1 billion people who were impoverished a generation ago now live in a middle-class standard along the Pacific Rim entirely because of globalized trade by sea. In fact, the reduction of poverty in Asia, which is kind of unknown in the Western world, polls show that Americans believe that poverty in Asia is increasing. In fact, it's rapidly declining. That reduction of poverty may be, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say this, one of the greatest achievements in human history. And yes, it was an achievement of the evil Chinese Communist Party, who nobody likes. I don't like them either. But you give credit where due, they're reducing poverty in their country. So first you have the decline of war at sea. Then you have the increase of trade at sea. And my section on this in the book, The Blue Age, ends by saying, we're living in the Blue Age and we're going to miss it badly if it's gone. If trade at sea is disrupted, inflation will immediately restart. And what's happened? That book went to the printer in April of 2021. Trade at sea began to be disrupted a few months later, and inflation has restarted. So I made a testable prediction that's turned out to be true. The third phase of the book is about what this says for environmental issues, because we're expanding the human footprint to the 3/4 of the Earth's surface, that is water, and we're about to get a brand new ocean. The Arctic Ocean is navigable if you have an icebreaker now. It's not really practical to cross the northern roof of the world. But sometime within the next 20 to 30 years, the Arctic Ocean will be navigable, another hard word to say, all year round. And in the history of humanity, there's never been a new ocean added. There are all kinds of environmental consequences, and we're not dealing with them in really any way except Hollywood rhetoric. The Law of the Sea Treaty, which is real and a nice step, is not sufficient to deal with any of the big ocean environment issues. There isn't any agency or organization that has clear jurisdiction, and this is 3/4 of the Earth's surface that we're talking about. We need to understand that one of the challenges of the coming generation is bringing good governance to the seas for environmental protection, labor protection, etc. All these things to me are of a piece. There's a military factor, there's an economic factor, and there's an environmental protection factor. And we should view them in an interdisciplinary way as all the same issue, and hopefully address them as all the same issue, because as I just said, to quote myself, we're living in the Blue Age and we're going to miss it badly if it's gone.
Fantastic summary. To the point about environmentalism, absolutely. And the environmental impacts of commercial trade are real, and they aren't just based on climate change. That, again, to the point that everything has become about climate change, and there are so many aspects of conservationism and environmentalism that have nothing to do with carbon or the warming of the atmosphere. Let's begin with the decline of war at sea and the story that you tell in the book, mainly around the role of the U.S. Navy in protecting commercial shipping lanes and in effectively guaranteeing the right of navigation and trade. How unusual is this? You said it hasn't been since the time of the Phoenicians, but flesh that out for me. How unusual is this in the history of seaborne trade and commerce? And what is the role of the U.S. Navy in all of this?
If you think about, let's think about roughly the last 500 years of world history, going basically back to the Portuguese navigators and the Dutch navigators from roughly 500 years ago. For 500 years, one of the top goals of great power politics has been sea power. The Dutch, the English, the Spanish, the Portuguese, Several others contested each other at sea all across the surface of the world. You go back another 500 years before that, the Chinese were in, and the Koreans, the old Joseon Koreans. We've forgotten that Korea used to be a world power, contested each other through sea power. Nations have sought total hegemony over the oceans. No nation has ever achieved it until the United States in the present day. And we have total control of the world's oceans. And even though the Chinese Navy is expanding, and that's a concern, and we can talk about that, the United States Navy is still the sheriff of the world's oceans. And what have we done with this total control of the world's oceans? We've guaranteed safe passage for ships of all but a handful of nations, except for North Korea, Iran, and a couple of others. The United States Navy protects the vessels of our competitors. They protect everybody. The Navy has not been used as a force for conquest. The United States has made a terrible number of military mistakes all around the world, and I dread the thought of the next one that we're going to make, because there will be another one. We have made terrible military mistakes, and the Navy has made some terrible military mistakes. But in general, the strongest naval force that's ever existed in the history of the world is not used to conquer other nations, is not used to steal resources, is not used to prevent other nations from trading with each other and from competing with us in trade. It's a guardian force, and we're all better off as a result. And I think because I often speak about the intellectual milieu, and I will again for a minute, I think the intellectual milieu on optimism versus pessimism has to be changed. We need to make optimism respectable intellectually. It was once in the past. Now only pessimism is respectable, and it's bad for us. But you take that same intellectual mindset and look at naval affairs. Intellectuals are just unwilling to say, you know what, this muscle-bound United States Navy, it's good for the world. People are better off because we have these powerful ships and great missiles and the men and women who work so hard to make them. Intellectuals just can't bring themselves to say that there's anything good about military power. Now, there's all kinds of things to worry about military power, and traditionally the intellectual world has considered the word hegemony to be a dirty word. The United States now has hegemony over the oceans of the world, but hegemony is only bad if you abuse it. And the United States Navy is not abusing it. It's protecting sea lanes. It's protecting all the vessels of the world with a couple of minor exceptions. And I'd argue that we should start protecting North Korean and Cuban ships too. But this is a whole way of thinking about military power that is completely absent from upper academia and the editorial pages of the New York Times, to give two examples.
Yeah, so again, fantastic. And a couple of thoughts. One, something that we discussed certainly in our episode with Peter Zeihan is that the primary beneficiaries of American hegemony on the seas has actually not been the United States. It's been countries that cannot guarantee their own security. China, for example, a huge importer of petroleum, chips, iron ore, you name it. Its success in raising hundreds of millions of people out of poverty came as a result of its ability to trade with the rest of the world. And so they depend on the security of those shipping lanes. So that's just an important point I wanted to make. Do you think that the reason why people don't appreciate the role of the Navy as a force for good in the world is because, again, it happens on the high seas, and that if something analogous were happening, if, for example, the U.S. Army were guaranteeing the analogous security of physical routes around the world, that people would have a very different view of its positive impact?
I think that's entirely possible. Most of what happens on the sea, we literally don't observe. It's very rare for an American citizen to observe an American warship. You've got to be out in the ocean to see one, or in a port facility, or at a naval base. Most ports and naval bases are closed to the public to begin with. Our soldiers can march at military parades on the 4th of July. The Air Force flies its fancy jets over the football stadiums before the kickoff of games. There's no comparable way that we physically observe the Navy. And the key thing about the period that we're talking about, the period of the Blue Age, is Because there isn't any fighting at sea, there's nothing to get upset about. There's way, way too much fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan and parts of Africa. War may be in decline, but it's still there. So there's something to get upset about. There's something to take pictures of. They're terrifying pictures. They're horrible. So they get a lot of attention on the evening news. You'll never get an evening news saying, well, we just went out to the Strait of Malacca. Everything is fine here. Everything is operating smoothly. The commercial ships are not fighting each other. They're not running into each other. Everything's fine here at the Strait of Malacca. Back to you, Clint. You're never going to get that. So the fact that fighting at sea has been prevented and continues to be prevented almost entirely by the United States Navy, doing this, as you correctly observed, even for China, is just something that has a hard time penetrating the American consciousness. And by the way, I think we should do this for China.
Yeah. So I think this subject is in the popular mind today in a way that it has not been, exactly because of the inflation that we're seeing, much of which is driven on the supply side by bottlenecks in the supply chains. And a lot of that is shipping related. Give our listeners a sense of the scale and importance of waterborne commerce. Like what percentage, for example, of kilometers traveled or traveled by water versus all other forms of transportation?
Percentage of kilometers traveled, I'm not sure of the number there, but the number that I do know is that 95% of international trade happens by sea, because the most obvious reason is because moving things by sea is much cheaper than moving them by air, and you can travel long distances by sea in a way that you physically cannot travel long distances by land. Also, in general, there are no barriers at sea. Suppose I've got a train full of goods that I want to move from, suppose I want to move my train full of goods from Germany to Saudi Arabia. There are a lot of physical barriers between those places. If I move those same goods by sea, there are no physical barriers, and the sea lanes are policed by the United States Navy, so nothing ever goes wrong there. I think people are becoming a little bit more aware of this because of all the saturation coverage of, especially of the problems at the Port of Los Angeles. And I'll tell you, in the Blue Age, Chapter 5 is about the Port of Los Angeles and its significance to the American economy and to the global flow of goods and trade. I did the reporting for that chapter by hanging around at the Port of Los Angeles in 2019. And the officials that I talked to and the dock workers and the others that I spoke with, crane operators, etc., common thing that they said was, so much of what America depends on passes through this port. Nobody even knows we exist. A full-length train, leaves the Port of Los Angeles every 37 minutes around the clock all year long. And people would say, nobody knows these trains are here. Nobody knows these trucks are here. Nobody even knows that our port exists. Well, everybody knows our port exists now, right? Suddenly the attention of the country is focused on the Port of Los Angeles. Suddenly we've realized how dependent we are on a free flow of goods. There are other countries that are equally dependent on a free flow of American goods. And it would help if we kind of bore these things in mind a little bit more.
So that's actually great that you brought up the Port of Los Angeles. You'll have to educate me on this or correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't the port dramatically expanded or commissioned to be expanded in the 1980s? Or was it the early 90s? And the mayor got a lot of flack for that, but it turned out to have been absolutely the right move.
Oh, yes. Yeah. You're thinking of the chronology of this is described in the Blue Age when Tom Bradley was mayor of Los Angeles in the early 80s, and he was a far-sighted politician. At that time, everyone's fear is that Japan would overwhelm the world economically. And boy, that sure didn't happen, did it? Japan's struggling and we're overwhelming them. But at that time, the way to keep the narrative negative, which is always the media goal, was to say Japan is about to crush us. So people were worried about Japanese trade. And Tom Bradley, being farsighted, looked at the world and said, it's the Pacific Rim. It's not just Japan, it's China, it's Indonesia. Someday it'll be Vietnam. We're going to be trading with all these societies. Let's expand the port. And he did. He succeeded in expanding the port. It was a big public works project. It cost a lot of money, just like the public works projects that are being contemplated now under the infrastructure bill. It was expensive. And 20 years from now, it'll seem like an incredible bargain. So Bradley got the port expanded. He then, a couple years later, ran for governor of California. He was defeated. the political line against him was, look at all the money he wasted on this port. This is a bridge to nowhere. Ha, ha, ha. Within 10 years of the expansion of the Port of Los Angeles, 10 is the key factor, the amount of trade passing through the Port of Los Angeles had increased tenfold. Now it's up to almost 20-fold compared to where it was when Bradley, this is the early 80s, started working on the problem. Other ports in many places, especially in China, have increased even more rapidly. If you go to the port of Shenzhen, which is a place that will make you just stand with your jaw hanging loose, because Shenzhen didn't even exist as a city 35 years ago and now is larger than Manhattan. You go to that port, the shipping containers, the things you see pictures of on the backs of trucks and ships, the shippers call them TEUs. That's the slang thing for them. It's about the size and shape of the box that goes on the back of a tractor-trailer truck. The port of Shenzhen in China now ships a TEU every other second, all day long, every day of the year. A speed and a volume that would have been unimaginable not long ago. And the Port of Los Angeles has been able to absorb this incredible profusion of trade pretty well until they started having trouble with labor this year, just the shortage of people who are both willing and able to work. And that shortage will eventually be corrected, but it hasn't been yet.
So, Gregg, I'm going to move the second half of our conversation into the overtime. The next thing I want to ask you about is these bottlenecks, because the Port of Los Angeles is actually a great one. There are a lot of theories as to why that have been circulating, as to why there have been bottlenecks, why the costs are escalating. 60 Minutes did recently a piece on them. The Biden administration has also blamed cartels of shipping companies as part of the cause. I'm curious to get your take on it, what you think is most responsible, and if you think many of these bottlenecks are going to persist, what will be required in order to alleviate them. And that, of course, feeds into the inflation story, which has been concerning everyone, because as you rightly point out, so many of the gains in inflation, the reason why central banks have been able to keep interest rates so low for so long and have such easy monetary policy, and why that hasn't generated consumer and producer price inflation, is because of globalization and containerization and shipping, and the scale and size of ships and how they've grown in size over the years is directly responsible for that. I mean, it's a huge part of the reason. And to that point about scale and size, I'm amazed, having spent some time, even before having read your book, learning about the shipping industry. I mean, the first book I'd ever read was Stopford's book on maritime economics. And I was amazed after reading your book to see just how much things have changed since that time and how much bigger these ships have gotten. I mean, you do a great job in the book of highlighting that the top of these the mast line, what's it called? The deck line, rather, of these ships in some cases exceeds the height of the Cinderella Castle in Disneyland. So that, in fact, it isn't just the U.S. Navy patrolling sea lanes that has reduced piracy. It's also these ships have gotten so big, you can't actually board them. Pirates can't board them. They need helicopters in some cases to actually get on. I mean, remarkable. That's something else that I want to discuss. I also want to bring it back to that third point you mentioned, which is environmentalism, and discuss that. But also, we've had this long period of peace. And while we haven't lived under hegemony the entire time, under American hegemony, we've had either a bipolar world or a world with America as the unipolar power. But we're moving away from that now. And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are about the likelihood that we're going to see a breakdown in the sort of unipolar security environment on the seas, where flashpoints, we hear a lot about Taiwan, whether there is reason to be concerned about that, what some of the flashpoints will be, etc. For anyone new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Gregg, as well as the transcripts and rundowns to this episode and every other episode we've ever done, head over to hiddenforces.io and check out our episode library, or subscribe directly through our Patreon page at patreon.com/hiddenforces. There's also a link in the summary page to this episode with instructions on how to connect the overtime feed to your phone so you can listen to these extra discussions just like you listen to the regular podcast. Gregg, stick around. We're going to move the second part of our conversation into the subscriber overtime. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Hidden Forces. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.